In 1977, an Italian Assyriologist named Luigi Canni published the first complete critical edition of a 3,000-year-old Akkadian poem called the Erra Epic. The text names 7 distinct instruments of destruction, assigns each one specific physical properties, and records what happened to every city they touched. Visitors to the British Museum walk past these tablets every week without stopping. But at archaeological sites scattered across 3 continents, the ground still carries thermal anomalies consistent with exactly what those tablets describe. The text has been translated. The sites have been excavated. The question is whether anyone has read both at the same time. The Erra Epic is not obscure. It is published, peer-reviewed, and taught in graduate programs in ancient Near Eastern studies at universities from Oxford to Chicago. Cagney's critical edition remains the standard scholarly reference. The poem centers on Erra, also known as Nergal, the Mesopotamian god of plague, war, and the underworld. Erra desires to unleash total devastation. He possesses 7 weapons called the Sibiti. These are not vague symbols. The text personifies them as entities with distinct destructive functions. 1 burns, 1 darkens the sky, 1 poisons the air, 1 shatters structures. The poem cycles through their deployment with a specificity that exceeds what mythology typically requires. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University, one of the foremost translators of Akkadian literature, includes the Erra Epic in her standard anthology, Myths from Mesopotamia. W.G. Lambert, whose Babylonian creation myths published in 2013, is considered the definitive modern treatment, treated the poem as a sophisticated theological work. Both scholars acknowledge the unusual level of technical detail in the weapon passages. The Erra Epic is real. Its translations are consistent across independent scholars, and what it describes has never been fully reconciled with the standard reading that these are simple metaphors for plague and social collapse. Mainstream Assyriology reads these tablets through a well-established framework. The Sibiti, the 7 weapons, are understood as mythological personifications. They represent the forces of chaos, disease, famine, and warfare that Mesopotamian civilization experienced cyclically. The Erra Epic is classified as a theodicy. It attempts to explain why the gods permit catastrophic suffering. Cagney himself interpreted the 7 weapons as literary devices representing plague and civic destruction. Lambert connected the poem to specific historical events, likely the Kassite or Elamite sackings of Babylon that left the city devastated multiple times during the 2nd millennium BCE. This reading has strong internal logic. Ancient peoples mythologized their disasters. They gave names and personalities to forces they could not control. The weapon language, in this interpretation, is genre convention. Gods in Mesopotamian literature always fight with exaggerated cosmic armaments. The 7 winds that Marduk deploys against Tiamat in the Enuma Elish follow the same literary pattern. So do the weapons carried by Ninurta in the Lugal-E. Scholars see a consistent poetic tradition, not a technical manual. This interpretation is coherent, well supported, and accepted across the discipline. But coherent is not the same as complete. The problem is specificity. If the Sibiti are simple personifications of plague, the text did not need to assign each one a distinct physical mechanism of destruction. Plague does not burn cities. Plague does not darken the sky. Plague does not shatter stone walls. Yet the Erra Epic describes all of these effects and attributes, each to a different weapon in the set of 7. The Lament for a completely separate text from a different period, preserved on tablets at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the destruction of the city of around 2004 BCE, using almost identical language. That text speaks of an evil wind sent by the god Enlil. Samuel Noah Kramer, the scholar who spent decades translating Sumerian literature at the University of Pennsylvania, noted the unusually physical quality of the destruction language. Thorkild Jacobson, translating the same lament tradition, rendered the wind as carrying a specific pestilential quality, unlike standard storm descriptions in Sumerian poetry. 2 independent textual traditions, different centuries, different cities, different scribal schools. Both describe the same cluster of physical phenomena attributed to deliberate divine weaponry. Calling this coincidental metaphor is possible, but it requires dismissing a pattern that the texts themselves make difficult to ignore. The combined textual record across the Erra Epic, the Enuma Elish, and the Lugal-E describes 7 categories of weapon with consistent attributes. The first is the burning weapon. The Erra Epic describes a force that incinerates cities and leaves the ground scorched. The evil wind of the lament for carries fire that consumes structures. Marduk's arsenal in Enuma Elish Tablet 4 includes lightning wielded as a weapon of directed destruction. Stephanie Daly's translation renders this lightning not as a weather event, but as a crafted instrument placed into Marduk's hand before battle. The Akkadian word used is not the standard term for natural lightning. It is a term that appears almost exclusively in weapon inventories across the corpus. That distinction matters. Scribes had vocabulary for storms. They chose different vocabulary here. The second is the darkening weapon. Multiple texts describe a weapon or wind that blocks sunlight, turning day into night over the affected region. The lament for Sumer and describes darkness falling over the city as the destruction begins. The Erra Epic attributes this effect to one specific member of the Sabiti. In Enuma Elish, the darkness that precedes Marduk's victory over Tiamat is described as a deliberate condition, not a natural consequence of weather. The scribes drew a distinction between darkness as environment and darkness as weapon. The third is the poison wind. This is the most disturbing category. The lament for describes people dying in the streets without visible battle wounds. The wind enters sealed homes. People who barricaded their doors still perished. Kramer translated passages describing bodies accumulating where they fell, with no evidence of combat, no arrows, no blade marks. Something in the air killed them. The text is explicit. The fourth is the shattering force. The Erra Epic describes structural destruction on a scale beyond what armies typically achieve. Walls collapse, foundations crack. The Enuma Elish describes Marduk's mace as a weapon designed to break physical matter. The fifth is the flooding weapon. Multiple Mesopotamian texts connect divine weaponry to catastrophic water events. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets at the British Museum from roughly 1700 BCE, links the god's destructive intent directly to a deluge mechanism. The sixth is the net, or entanglement weapon. Enuma Elish, Tablet 4, describes a net specifically crafted to immobilize Tiamat, preventing her movement before the killing strike. This is not a metaphor woven into the narrative for poetic color. The text describes its construction, its tactical purpose, and its deployment in sequence. The seventh is the most remarkable. The Lugal-E, translated by J.J.A. Van Dyke in 1983 and more recently by Benjamin Foster, describes a weapon called the Sharur, wielded by the god Ninurta. The Sharur is not a simple mace or blade. The text describes it as an entity that communicates with its wielder. It scouts enemy positions. It reports back with tactical information. It operates with autonomous function. Zechariah Sitchin, in The Wars of Gods and Men, published in 1985, interpreted the Sharur as a guided projectile or drone-like device operating on principles that ancient scribes could only render in the language of divine agency. Heiser and other mainstream scholars reject this reading on linguistic grounds. But the textual detail is there, regardless of interpretation. No other weapon in ancient literature from any civilization is described with this degree of independent agency. The scribes who wrote these lines were describing something. The debate is only about what. The standard scholarly response to these readings is direct. Michael S. Heiser, the late biblical scholar and vocal critic of alternative interpretations, argued that the Sabiti are well-documented astral deities associated with the Pleiades star cluster in Mesopotamian astronomical tradition. Their role as weapons in the Erra Epic is literary convention, not technological description. The personification of destructive forces is standard practice across all ancient mythologies. Greek poets personified plague as Apollo's arrows. Norse skalds described thunder as Thor's hammer. These are poetic devices, not engineering schematics. Cagny himself never suggested the 7 weapons were anything other than narrative constructs within a theological framework. The connection between the Erra Epic and any physical evidence on the ground is, in the mainstream view, an interpretive leap without peer-reviewed support. This objection has merit, but it addresses the theological framing while leaving the physical specificity untouched. It explains why the texts exist. It does not explain why their destruction language maps so precisely onto documented phenomena at real archaeological sites. The lament for deserves closer examination. The tablets at the University of Pennsylvania Museum preserve one of the most emotionally devastating texts in all of ancient literature. The poem describes the final days of a real city whose ruins still stand in modern southern Iraq, near the town of Nasiriyah. Around 2004 BCE, something destroyed it. The text says, Enlil sent a storm. But this is not a normal storm. Kramer's translation describes the wind moving across the land with lethal intent. People ran through the streets and collapsed. Animals fell in the fields. The text says the wind entered homes where people had sealed the doors. They died inside. There are no descriptions of enemy soldiers, no descriptions of siege weapons or battering rams, no descriptions of arrows or spears. The killing agent is the wind itself, carrying something that the scribes could describe only as an evil carried on the air. Jacobson noted that the Sumerian terminology used for this wind is distinct from the vocabulary used for natural storms elsewhere in the literary corpus. The scribes of chose specific words. They were describing something they had either witnessed or received detailed accounts of. The lament also describes a spatial pattern to the destruction. The wind came from a specific direction. It moved along a specific path. Certain districts of the city were struck first. Others experienced the killing wind later. This directional specificity appears in no standard storm poetry from the Sumerian corpus. Normal storm descriptions do not track direction through a city street by street. This one does. The poem records which temple precincts fell silent first. It records which marketplaces emptied before the others. It reads, in places, less like theological lamentation and more like a damage survey conducted in sequence from point of origin outward. And the city of was indeed abandoned after this period. The archaeological record confirms a destruction horizon consistent with the textual dating. Something ended that city. The tablets describe the mechanism. The ground confirms the event. Mesopotamia is not the only ancient civilization that preserved memories of devastating aerial weapons deployed before recorded history. The Mahabharata, the Sanskrit epic composed in India, contains passages in the Dronapava section describing a weapon called the Brahmastra. The text states it produced an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns. Survivors of its deployment experienced their hair and nails falling out. Their food became contaminated. These descriptions appear in a text composed no later than 400 BCE and likely drawing on far older oral traditions. When J. Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the first nuclear detonation at the Trinity test site in White Sands, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, he directly cited the Bhagavad Gita, the philosophical core of the Mahabharata. He recognized something in that ancient text. The Book of Genesis, chapters 18 and 19, describes the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by fire and brimstone falling from the sky. The cities were located in the Jordan Valley. The Quran's Surah Hud preserves a parallel account of the same event. Hopi oral tradition in North America describes previous worlds destroyed by catastrophic means. The third world, in Hopi cosmology, was annihilated by fire from above before the current fourth world began. These cultures had no documented contact with one another. They were separated by oceans, by millennia, by entirely distinct linguistic and religious traditions. Yet each preserved detailed accounts of weapons or forces deployed from the sky that burned, poisoned, and annihilated populations. The pattern does not prove a shared origin. But the convergence across this many independent traditions is a data point that demands more than dismissal. The strongest skeptical case accounts for each of these parallels individually. Cross-cultural memories of destruction likely reflect shared human experience of natural catastrophes. Meteor impacts, volcanic eruptions, and extreme weather events affected civilizations worldwide. Ancient peoples mythologized these events, attributing them to divine agency because they lacked the scientific framework to explain them otherwise. The Tall El Hammam destruction event in the Jordan Valley, documented in a 2021 peer-reviewed study in Nature Scientific Reports, was caused by a cosmic airburst, not a weapon. The Mahabharata's weapon descriptions are literary hyperbole within an epic poem. Libyan desert glass in the western Egyptian Sahara dates to approximately 29 million years ago, long before any human civilization existed. Mohenjo-Daro in modern Pakistan's Sindh province was most likely abandoned due to shifting river patterns and the broader collapse of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 BCE. Each individual anomaly has a plausible natural explanation. This matters. Responsible analysis requires acknowledging that the skeptical position is not weak, it is coherent and well defended. But it addresses each case in isolation. It does not address the convergence pattern across texts and sites, and it does not explain why the specific physical effects described in 3,000-year-old cuneiform match the specific physical signatures found in the ground. The ground is where the argument either holds or collapses. At Mohenjo-Daro, Sir John Marshall's excavations in the 1920s uncovered skeletal remains in the streets, bodies in positions suggesting sudden death rather than gradual decline. In 1979, Italian researchers David Davenport and Ettore Vincenti published analyses identifying vitrified materials and fused pottery at the site, consistent with extreme thermal events far exceeding what normal fires produce. Mainstream archaeology has not fully refuted these thermal claims, though it attributes the city's end to other causes. At the center of the site, the researchers identified a roughly circular zone of maximum thermal intensity, with the degree of fusing and vitrification diminishing outward from that point in a radial pattern. That radial distribution is not what ground fires produce. Ground fires spread along fuel sources. They follow wood, thatch, and textile. They do not produce a circular zone of maximum intensity from a central point with graduated damage spreading outward. The pattern at Mohenjo-Daro is consistent with an event originating above the surface. In the western Egyptian desert, fragments of Libyan desert glass lie scattered across the Great Sand Sea. This naturally occurring silica glass requires temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Celsius to form. No confirmed impact crater has ever been found beneath the glass field. The material was known to ancient Egyptians. A carved scarab of Libyan desert glass sits in the pectoral ornament found in Tutankhamun's tomb, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. At Tall El Hammam in the southern Jordan Valley, the 2021 study led by Ted Bunch and published in Nature Scientific Reports documented shocked quartz, melted pottery, diamonoids, and other markers consistent with a cosmic airburst event dated to approximately 1650 BCE. The researchers explicitly compared the thermal signatures to those found at nuclear detonation test sites. The peak surface temperatures at Tall El Hammam, as inferred from the physical evidence, exceeded those produced by volcanic pyroclastic flows. The city's mud brick walls show evidence of instantaneous melting on their upper surfaces, while lower courses remain intact. That pattern, upper surfaces destroyed while foundations survive, is characteristic of an intense heat source originating from above rather than from within the structure. At White Sands, New Mexico, the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, produced trinitite, a green glass formed when desert sand was superheated beyond 1500 degrees Celsius. Trinitite's mineralogical structure provides a modern baseline for identifying extreme thermal events in the geological record. The comparison between trinitite and the vitrified materials found at ancient destruction sites is not alternative speculation. It is a methodology used in the Bunch study itself, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. A clay tablet sits in a climate-controlled case at the British Museum. The cuneiform is 3,000 years old. The wedge-shaped impressions describe 7 weapons that burn, darken, poison, shatter, flood, entangle, and strike with autonomous precision. At Mohenjo-Daro, skeletons lie in the streets of a city that died suddenly. In the Western Sahara, glass forged at temperatures no normal fire can reach covers the desert floor with no crater to explain it. In the Jordan Valley, a peer-reviewed study documents shocked quartz and melted stone at a site ancient texts say was destroyed by fire from the sky. The cuneiform has said what it has to say. The ground has shown what it shows. The only question left is whether anyone is willing to read both at the same time.